Hey, I'm Matthew from Dark Ascent, and today I'm going to compare a $30,000 Everest expedition to a $300,000 luxury climb. One climber had limited resources, trusting experience alone. The other was relatively inexperienced but prepared with every resource money could buy. Both believed they were ready. I'll break down each expedition step by step, and fair warning, one ended in brutal ways you won't see coming. It was April 3rd, 2016, and Eric Lindgren had just wired $28,500 to a Kathmandu-based expedition company he had spent 4 months researching. The fee covered his Everest climbing permit, which alone cost the Nepalese government's standard $11,000, along with base camp logistics, a shared mess tent, basic food service, icefall route access, and one shared Sherpa among every 3 to 4 clients. That was it. There was no personal guide, no private tent, no dedicated weather forecasting, no helicopter standby, and no guaranteed oxygen beyond 4 bottles allocated for the summit push. Everything else, his clothing system, his sleeping bag rated to -40, his boots, crampons, harness, ascender, and every piece of technical equipment he would carry above base camp, he had purchased, tested, and packed himself. Okay, now I definitely understand experience and expertise matter a lot, but when I read this part, I was baffled. He was about to face the highest peak in the world with only the bare minimum essentials. I'd be lying if I didn't say I thought he was stupid. Eric was 36 years old, originally from Bozeman, Montana, and had been climbing seriously since he was 19. He worked seasonal contracts as a wilderness firefighter, a job that gave him 4 to 5 months of open time each year, and the kind of cardiovascular conditioning that most climbers spent years trying to develop. His mountaineering resume was not built on guided trips or trophy summits. He had climbed Denali twice by the West Buttress, completed a winter ascent of Aconcagwa's Polish glacier route, summited Cho Oyu in 2013 without supplemental oxygen above Camp 2, and reached the top of Manaslu in 2014 during a weather window so narrow that only 4 teams attempted the push. He had turned back twice, once on Broad Peak due to unstable snow conditions, once on Makalu when a teammate developed pulmonary edema at Camp 3. In climbing circles, the willingness to turn around said more about a person than any summit list. Eric had learned that lesson early and carried it as a permanent operating principle. At $28,500, Eric's expedition sat near the lower end of what Everest cost in 2016. The most affordable permits, typically offered through Nepali operators with minimal Western oversight, ran between $25,000 and $35,000, depending on the services included. These operators handled the essential logistics, base camp infrastructure, icefall access fees paid to the Sagarmatha Pollution Control Committee, shared cooking staff, and basic Sherpa support during the summit push. Based on my research, they did not provide the safety architecture that more expensive expeditions built into their packages. The assumption baked into the price was that climbers at this level already knew what they were doing, and if they didn't, the mountain would teach them in ways the operator couldn't be held responsible for. But later in this video, I'll show you what a greener climber gets when they make up for inexperience with preparation and money, and whether that extra investment actually translates to survival. Eric flew into Lukla in early April and began the 10-day trek to base camp along the standard route through Namche Bazaar and the Khumbu Valley. The trek served a dual purpose, covering the 60-mile approach while allowing gradual acclimatization from 9,300 feet at Lukla to 17,600 feet at base camp. He arrived in mid-April, moving efficiently but without rushing, allowing his red blood cell production to ramp up naturally with each day spent at increasing altitude. Base camp was a sprawling temporary city of roughly 1,000 people spread across the Khumbu Glacier's lateral moraine, uneven rock and ice that shifted and groaned beneath the tents. Eric's accommodation was a 2-person tent he shared with another client. The tent floor was a thin foam pad laid over fractured ice that transmitted cold through sleeping bags regardless of their temperature rating. Sleep came in fragments, 2 or 3 hours at a time, interrupted by the crack of shifting ice. The persistent headache of altitude and the need to urinate multiple times per night as his body processed the excess fluid that altitude physiology demanded. When I was studying the topic, I found out apparently food at the budget level was functional and serviceable, but repetitive. Breakfast was typically porridge or chapati with jam. Lunch and dinner rotated through dalbat, rice with canned vegetables, and occasionally pasta with a sauce that bore little resemblance to anything served at lower altitudes. Honestly, I'll never try to climb the highest mountain in the world alone, but this actually doesn't sound too bad, all things considered. During climbs, calories were essential. Climbers at base camp burned between 3,000 and 4,000 calories daily, even on rest days. But appetite suppression at altitude made eating a discipline rather than a pleasure. When I dig deeper into the food situation, most climbers just forced down their every meal, knowing that each calorie stored now was energy they would need above 26,000 feet. On more expensive expeditions, climbers often eat meals prepared by personal chefs, fresh bread, eggs cooked to order, even imported coffee. But that was not the experience at Eric's price point. Well, whether better food translates to better performance above the death zone is something I'll reveal later. Acclimatization began in late April with the first rotation through the Khumbu icefall. The icefall was a 2,000-foot maze of ice blocks, some the size of small buildings, that shifted, cracked, and collapsed without warning. Aluminum ladders lashed together with rope-spanned crevasses that dropped hundreds of feet into blue darkness. The route changed almost daily as the glacier moved, and the Sherpa icefall doctors, a specialized team paid by all expeditions collectively, adjusted ladder placements and fixed new rope sections as old ones became impassable. I found out from making and researching all these videos that apparently most Everest deaths in the icefall were caused by serac collapse, enormous ice towers that calved without warning and buried everything beneath them. Speed was the only defense. Eric crossed the icefall in roughly 4 hours on his first rotation, fast by client standards, his crampons biting confidently into surfaces he understood from years of glacier travel. The first rotation took him to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet. He spent one night and descended. The second pushed to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet, deep in the glacial valley where Everest's southwest face and the Lhotse Wall created a basin that trapped solar radiation during the day, driving temperatures above 50 degrees Fahrenheit despite the altitude, before plunging well below zero after sunset. Eric spent 2 nights at Camp 2, eating freeze-dried meals he had carried himself and melting snow for water on a shared stove. The third rotation reached Camp 3 at 23,500 feet on the Lhotse face, a steep wall of blue ice that required front pointing on crampons while clipped to fixed ropes for nearly 3,000 vertical feet. This was where the climbing shifted from exhausting to genuinely dangerous. Eric moved with practiced efficiency, his ice axe placements deliberate, his breathing timed to a rhythm he had developed over years of high-altitude climbing, 3 breaths per step above 23,000 feet, a ratio that kept his heart rate manageable and his oxygen saturation from crashing. He spent one night at Camp 3 and descended to base camp for final rest before the summit push. This is where I saw his experience starting to shine. Eric managed his oxygen with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much he had and exactly how long it needed to last. His 4-bottle allocation, the standard for budget expeditions, gave him roughly 24 hours of supplemental oxygen at a flow rate of 2 liters per minute. Most climbers used oxygen from Camp 4 onward, meaning he needed those 4 bottles to cover the ascent from the South Col to the summit and back down. There was almost no margin, a delay on the Hillary step, a wrong turn in the dark, a traffic jam on the summit ridge. Any of these could burn through his supply before he reached safety. Something that I thought was unfair yet understandable was some climbers on more expensive expeditions typically carry 6 to 8 bottles, sometimes more, with Sherpas hauling additional reserves to cache at strategic points along the route. Eric did not have that luxury. His oxygen discipline would need to be flawless. The summit window opened around May 18th. Weather windows on Everest were not gentle invitations. They were brief collapses in the jet stream that reduced wind speeds on the upper mountain from unsurvivable to merely dangerous. When a window opened, every team on the mountain moved simultaneously, creating traffic that could turn the narrow sections above 28,000 feet into bottlenecks where climbers stood motionless in minus 30-degree wind chill, burning oxygen and body heat while waiting for others to move. Eric reached Camp 4 on the South Col by early afternoon on May 20th, 26,000 feet, the threshold of the death zone, where the air held roughly 1/3 the oxygen available at sea level. The body cannot survive here indefinitely. Every hour causes cumulative damage. Muscles break down, cognition degrades, and the risk of edema increases by the minute. When I looked up pictures online, the col itself was a desolate plateau littered with decades of debris, abandoned oxygen bottles, shredded tents, and the occasional body too remote to recover. Eric rested for 6 hours, forced down energy gels and soup, and departed for the summit around midnight. He climbed by headlamp at 2 liters of oxygen per minute, slow enough to conserve energy, fast enough to stay ahead of the traffic behind him. The route climbed the triangular face to the balcony at 27,600 feet, where he swapped bottles, then traversed exposed ridgeline to the south summit at 28,700 feet, a false peak marking the start of the most committing terrain on the mountain. The Hillary Step appeared in early light, a near vertical pitch of rock and ice that funneled every climber into a single bottleneck. Eric reached it around 7:40 a.m., with only 2 climbers ahead. His early departure had bought him positioning that avoided the worst congestion. And honestly, I was a bit frustrated when I found out how differently expensive expeditions handle this. Dedicated Sherpas, securing priority positioning, teams negotiating departure times to skip the queue entirely. Eric had none of that. He had a watch, a forecast, and the discipline to leave camp before most climbers had finished putting on their boots. He cleared the Hillary Step within roughly 25 minutes and climbed the final summit ridge, a narrow spine of snow with exposure falling away thousands of feet on both sides into Tibet and Nepal. The wind was manageable, around 20 miles per hour, and the sky was clear enough to see the curvature of the earth at the horizon. And against all odds, Eric Lindgren reached the summit of Mount Everest at approximately 8:50 a.m. on May the 21st, 2016. He stood at 29,029 feet, took 4 photographs, and spent less than 10 minutes at the top. I'll have to be honest, I think it's still stupid to attempt an Everest climb alone, but I have to commend how skilled Eric is. But as I and many other regulars on this channel know, the summit isn't even the most dangerous part of climbing. It was the descent, and Eric knew the statistics that governed this altitude. Most Everest deaths occurred during the descent, when exhaustion, oxygen depletion, and the false relief of having summited combined to destroy the focus that kept climbers alive. The summit was not the finish line. Camp 4 was. His descent was methodical and deliberate. He down-climbed the Hillary Step before the upward traffic created a gridlock that would trap later climbers for hours. He reached the balcony by late morning, swapped to his 3rd oxygen bottle, and continued descending through the steepening terrain below. By mid-afternoon, he was back at Camp 4 on the South Col, exhausted to a degree that made his hands tremble as he unclipped from the fixed line, but alive and coherent. His oxygen supply had 1 bottle remaining. The math had held because he had never allowed it to become uncertain. Eric Lindgren had summited Mount Everest on a $28,500 budget with 4 oxygen bottles, no personal Sherpa, no private guide, and no safety net beyond his own experience. He rested at Camp 4 for the night, descended through the lower camps over the following 2 days, and walked out of base camp on May 25th. And wow, I have to say, I still stand by it being a stupid decision, but I have to give my props to Eric. Pure skill, experience, and determination. But on that same mountain, during that same season, another climber was preparing for the same summit, with an approach so different it barely resembled the same sport. And trust me, the outcome would be nothing like Eric's. Quick reminder, if you're finding this breakdown valuable, subscribing and leaving a like helps the channel keep making videos like this. Now let's get back to the mountain. It was March 14th, 2016, and Garrett Ashworth had never worried about what Everest cost. He had worried about what it would look like, the photos, the story, the way it would land at dinner parties and investor meetings, and he had spent accordingly. Garrett was 44 years old, a former hedge fund manager from Greenwich, Connecticut, who had sold his stake in a mid-sized investment firm 2 years earlier. He had spent the months since collecting adventures the way he once collected returns: safaris, sailing trips, helicopter tours, each one documented and shared with a growing audience, tracking his transformation from Wall Street to adventurer. And this part really annoyed me, but Everest was the capstone for him, not because he loved climbing. He had started only 2 years earlier, but because no other mountain carried the same cultural weight. But honestly, compared to the other climbers I've covered on the channel, he isn't that bad of a guy from what I've read, and surprisingly, I found out his experience and skill wasn't bad at all. It was limited but not non-existent. He'd summited Kilimanjaro, completed a guided ascent of Elbrus at 18,510 feet and reached the top of Aconcagua at 22,841 feet, though the final push required 2 guides flanking him. But he had never climbed steep ice before Everest, never managed his own oxygen, and never made a critical decision above 20,000 feet without a guide telling him what to do. What Garrett lacked in experience, he made up for in spending. His expedition cost $295,000, more than 10 times what Eric paid. That money bought a personal Sherpa from base camp to summit, a second support Sherpa, a private tent with solar lighting and a charging station, a heated dining tent with a personal cook, satellite phone, dedicated Wi-Fi, a Western guide with 14 Everest summits, private weather forecasting, a pre-acclimatization program, helicopter transport, and 8 oxygen bottles, double Eric's allocation, with 2 emergency bottles cached higher up. A completely different sport played on the same field. And when I first looked at both climbs side by side, I couldn't tell which one would go smoother. One had pure skill but almost no resources. The other was relatively newer, but still had achievements under his belt and had every resource money could buy and was surrounded by experts. Garrett arrived at base camp in mid-April. His tent was already erected, his sleeping bag laid out, a welcome meal of garlic soup, yak steak, and chocolate cake waiting in the heated dining tent. Outside, prayer flags popped in the wind, and avalanche debris smoked off Nuptsy's flanks. Inside, the environment felt closer to a remote lodge than a glacial campsite at 17,600 feet. Based on an interview I found from his lead guide, Callum Reed, that he stated he assessed Garrett during the first acclimatization rotation and identified the patterns he expected. Adequate fitness, but rudimentary technical skills, hesitant crampon technique, inconsistent pacing that burned energy at rates the mountain would eventually punish. His pre-acclimatization had worked on paper, but the rotations revealed what luxury infrastructure could and could not compensate for. On the climb to Camp 2, Garrett's personal Sherpa, Nima Tenjin, carried roughly 70% of his gear. Garrett climbed with a light pack, water, snacks, a down jacket. The reduced weight made the climbing feel manageable and created a confidence that was partly real and partly manufactured. Eric knew exactly how hard the mountain was because he felt every ounce of it. Garrett's experience was filtered through layers of support that softened the signal his body was trying to send. The third rotation to Camp 3 on the Lhotse face exposed the limits more clearly. Garrett struggled on the steep ice, relying on the fixed rope rather than his own placements. Nima guided his boot onto footholds from below. The ascent that took Eric roughly 5.5 hours took Garrett nearly 9. Callum concluded privately that Garrett could summit, but only if conditions were favorable and the weather window wide enough to absorb the delays his pace would create. The summit window arrived around May 18th, the same window Eric used. When Garrett reached Camp 4 on the South Col on the afternoon of May 20th, his tent was already set up, oxygen laid out, hot water waiting. He rested poorly. Less than 2 hours of fragmented sleep, interrupted by Cheney-Stokes respiration, the gasping breathing pattern common at extreme altitude. Honestly, I had a tough time putting together this part. His priorities were wrong, but unlike the other climbers I've covered on the channel, he didn't seem that bad of a guy. The summit push began around 11:30 p.m. Garrett climbed at 3 liters per minute of oxygen, higher than Eric's 2 liters, compensating for lower efficiency. They reached the balcony around 5:45 a.m., nearly 90 minutes slower than Eric. The turnaround time was 1 p.m. Summit by then, or turn around. I was shocked to find out that was the protocol. That was what the $295,000 was supposed to enforce. Above the balcony, traffic thickened. Queues formed where climbers stood motionless for 10 to 15 minutes at 28,000 feet, burning oxygen without gaining altitude, losing body heat into minus 30-degree air, hypoxia advancing unchecked. Garrett's flow rate stayed at 3 liters because Nima judged that reducing it would accelerate cognitive decline. They reached the south summit around 9:50 a.m. Over 10 hours of climbing, and I started getting scared when I discovered their oxygen was being consumed faster than projected. 2 bottles empty, a third half depleted. The emergency caches had been picked up to provide a buffer the math hadn't originally required. The surplus that was supposed to guarantee safety was evaporating. Callum's weather service had flagged afternoon winds, building faster than the original forecast, conditions that would make the descent significantly more dangerous if the team was still above 28,000 feet by mid-afternoon. A more experienced climber might have read that update as a reason to turn around. Callum relayed the information to Nima, but left the turnaround time unchanged. The Hillary step queue cost roughly 45 minutes. When his turn came, Garrett hauled on the fixed rope with his arms as much as his legs. Nima pushed from below on 2 moves where his crampons failed to find purchase. Garrett Ashworth reached the summit at approximately 12:15 p.m. on May 21st, 2016. Nima took dozens of photographs, Garrett with a flag bearing his former firm's logo, a personal banner, selfies with the summit marker. The wind was increasing, the temperature dropping, the clock running in a direction photographs could not reverse. They spent over 20 minutes on the summit before beginning the descent around 12:37 p.m. He had summited before the turnaround, but summiting on time meant nothing if the body had already spent its reserves getting there. The descent revealed what the ascent had concealed. The Hillary step-down climb took roughly 11 minutes instead of the usual 3 to 4. Below the step, his responses to Nima arrived with a 2 to 3 second delay. This was when I started preparing myself for the worst. Around 2:10 p.m., below the south summit, Garrett stopped walking and stood motionless. Nima found him staring at the snow with no urgency, no fear, no recognition that stopping at 28,600 feet was dangerous. Nima increased oxygen to maximum. It would drain the bottle within 40 minutes, but might restore enough function to keep him moving. The improvement was temporary, a debt of exhaustion, caloric depletion, and cumulative cellular damage that no flow rate could repay. Around 3:20 p.m., above the balcony at roughly 27,500 feet, Garrett's coordination failed completely. His crampon caught the fixed rope, he pitched forward, and Nima caught his harness. The oxygen bottle emptied. Nima swapped in the last full bottle, one remaining, roughly an hour of oxygen, a descent that would take considerably longer. Nima radioed Callum, client deteriorating, oxygen critical, send a Sherpa with bottles up from Camp 4. But that meant 2 hours of uphill climbing at 26,000 feet, which I'm sure you all know by now is not an easy feat, especially when time was running out. Below the balcony, the decline accelerated. Steps became shuffles. Rest stops stretched from 30 seconds to 5 minutes. Speech fragmented into half-formed words. Nima locked an arm through his harness and guided him, step by step, down terrain. Garrett could no longer evaluate. Around 4:40 p.m., at roughly 26,800 feet, about 800 feet above Camp 4, Garrett sat down and did not respond. His oxygen had been empty for approximately 15 minutes. Breathing shallow and irregular, skin waxy gray, Nima wrapped him in a bivouac sack and waited. The support Sherpa arrived around 5:25 p.m. with 2 bottles. One was fitted to Garrett's mask at maximum flow. No response. Breathing periodic. Long pauses followed by gasps. Core temperature likely in the mid-80s. They managed to move him roughly 100 feet before the effort became unsustainable. 2 men could not carry a third down steep terrain at 26,700 feet without risking their own lives. And this next I already saw coming, but it still broke my heart when I was putting together the video. Garrett Ashworth was left at 26,700 feet. Nima descended to Camp 4 in darkness, with frostbite on 3 fingers. A recovery team found him at first light, seated in the bivouac sack, oxygen mask still fitted, bottle empty. The official cause of death was exhaustion, complicated by severe hypoxia and hypothermia at extreme altitude. The 2 climbers who attempted Everest that season could not have had less in common. One spent $28,500, carried his own gear, managed his own oxygen, and made every decision himself. He summited and walked out of base camp 6 days later. The other spent $295,000 with every logistical advantage money could provide. He summited and never made it off the mountain. I guess this just goes to show you that money bought on Everest was indeed a real improvement. Comfort, logistics, oxygen reserves, satellite communications, heated tents, personal cooks. The system performed precisely as designed. It carried him higher than his body was prepared to go, kept him comfortable enough to never question whether he belonged there, and delivered him to an altitude where the only thing that could save him was something no amount of money could purchase. The years of accumulated judgment, physiological adaptation, and self-awareness that told a climber when the mountain had given everything it was going to give. Eric Lindgren knew that language because he had spent 17 years learning to hear it. Garrett Ashworth never had the chance.